Yes, hello and welcome to the Adaptation Challenge, New Approaches to Climate Change Resistance. My name is Terry Martin. I'm a senior anchor at DW News, that's Germany's foreign broadcasting service. If you're staying in this hotel, I think you will find it in your hotel, on your television. In any case, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank both the Gates Foundation and, of course, the Doha Forum for organizing this and for inviting me to serve as moderator. I'm going to give a quick introduction to what we're doing here thematically, and then I'll introduce each of our four distinguished speakers. We will then have a conversation, and we will, at the end, hopefully have about 10 or 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. So as we are having our discussion, please be thinking about what questions you might want to ask, and we'll be sending around microphones for people to participate. So, what are we talking about? We, of course, are talking about climate change, the climate change challenge. It's on everybody's mind. Just about every session I've attended here, even if the session had nothing to do with climate change, the topic of climate change came up. It is on everyone's minds, and that's because we have recognized that climate change is a reality. The world is getting hotter. There are more extreme climate events. They are becoming much more common. So what are we doing about it? Well, we are working on the mitigation side. We have agreed as a planet that we want to try to prevent the planet from warming up, we want to fight the human causes of climate change. But that doesn't help us really on the adaptation side, on coping with the effects of climate change. Attention must be paid to that if we are going to cope with what the future will hold. And that's what we're talking about today, of course, on the adaptation side. We're talking about adaptation technologies and approaches. And we're talking about ways of protecting people from the negative effects of climate change. We're talking particularly about protecting those people who are most vulnerable in the developing world. Now, climate change adaptation is a rather broad topic, and it covers a couple of things that we're probably not going to get into during the next hour. It covers cities and urban planning and infrastructure on that side. We're not going to be talking so much about that. Because of the expertise that we have gathered here on this stage, we're going to be talking more about food security, about the natural environment, water management, risk management, maybe a little bit about finance. That's always a part of this too. Before we get started, just a couple of figures to mull around in your mind. Consider this. By the year 2050, global demand for food will increase by 50%, and yields during that time may decline by up to 30%. The 500 million small farmers in the world are expected to be most affected by these developments. Now, climate change could push, I'll go tell you where these figures came from in a moment. Climate change could push more than 100 million people within developing countries below the poverty line by 2030. That's not very far away, 100 million more people going below the poverty line because of climate change within the next 20 years, next 10 years, 11 years. Anyway, those figures are from the Global Commission on Adaptation. That is an organization headed up by Ban Ki-moon, who is also here at this conference, and Bill Gates, among others. These are pretty fresh numbers. If you want that report, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm very easy to find on the internet. So that's our topic. Now our speakers, starting here on my immediate left, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Agnes Kalibata. She is president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, also known as AGRA. Next to her, we have His Excellency Fahad bin Mohammed Al-Attiyah. He is Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the State of Qatar to the Russian Federation, but he has also served as director of Qatar's National Food Security Program and helped to organize one of the global UN climate conferences here in Qatar just a few years ago. I forgot to mention, however, it's very important too to note that Dr. Kalibata was also the agriculture minister of Rwanda. That's an important bit of experience to note. And a little further down here, we have Professor Li Xiaoyun. He is Honorary Dean at the China Institute for South-South Cooperation in Agriculture at the China Agricultural University. He's been deeply involved in China's poverty reduction and rural development programs over the past couple of decades, playing a leading role in structuring that policy. And finally, at the end, Mr. Joe Cerrell, a managing director for global policy and advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He also served with Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States, in the Clinton administration, and has been dealing with global health issues in a serious way for a long time. Now, anyway, a warm round of applause for our guests before we get going. The first question I want to put to you is a very broad question, so you can take this wherever your experience may lead you. Climate change affects different places in different ways, and not all communities have the same capacities to adapt. Solutions need to be tailored to address those different sets of circumstances in different countries. So my question to you, do we have the knowledge and the expertise needed to address these different sets of circumstances related to climate change? Do we have, right now, what we need in terms of knowledge and expertise to address the climate change challenge? Who would like to begin? Ladies first, okay. Dr. Kalibata.
Thank you. And thank you for having me over to participate in this conference. So I guess to answer this question, the best thing is to really look at circumstances that are happening in different places. We all come from different regions, circumstances that people are dealing with because of climate change in different regions. I come from Africa. AGRA is about Africa. We are an institution that works to improve the lives of smallholder farmers. So Africa's population is still farming. 70% of our people are still farming. So climate change happens a lot outdoors, if I might use that word. Of course, it also does affect some of what is happening in how we are settled, and we can go back to that. But in terms of the part that I'm talking about outdoors, it really affects how people are farming in Africa. Africa's situation is such that because we are smallholder farmers, they depend a lot. These people depend a lot on the knowledge they have that they built over millions of years in terms of how to deal with climate. And to the extent possible, it has really been extremely predictable. What climate change has done is to mess up with that knowledge. So that would be point number one. So do we have the necessary ability to deal with that mix-up of knowledge? I would say yes and no. Yes, because we are beginning to see huge improvements in how we understand weather and how we deal with weather. And in fact, very recently I was talking to a group out there that was telling me that they now have a solution. And I was like, okay, I'm really, really interested because we work across the continent and we can help you take this across the continent. But when they told me about the solution, it was only 15 days. I could only see 15 days ahead of where I was at. So I'm like, if I tell a farmer to plant now, they don't know what's happening in 3 months when the crop is supposed to be harvested. So the idea of dealing with variability of climate is still a major challenge for the African continent, and it's not yet clear that we have a solution that can tell people, yes, you can plant now because you are sure of your harvest. You don't know what is. Right now we are in the midst of a harvest and it is raining like crazy. Most of the crops are being lost. So that's number one. The second bit is on productivity itself. So productivity comes from 3 elements. Do you have the right varieties? I think we do, and to some extent. And a lot of it is also going to come from the current investments that we are seeing that are going to go into more research. Where don't we have the right varieties? We don't have the right varieties because, again, climate has changed in the sense that We need, what was working yesterday in what environment is not going to work. We have one of the most sophisticated agroecology. The continent has one of the most sophisticated agroecology in the sense of diversity. And that's the reason agro was set up, by the way, to deal with Africa's microecologies. And these microecologies, what we are growing there then, what I was saying we have, is now beginning not to work. And if it is not beginning to work, what are we going to do? So that's one of the challenges that I hope we can, as a panel, I can learn from other panelists as well as how we are going to address that. So that productivity bit. But I also wanted to say that unfortunately, and the reason we must address the issue of productivity a lot is when my people, my farmers, the farmers I know, when they don't produce enough from the land they are farming, because land is still available, they do more land. And that's probably what you don't want from a climate change perspective. We're still producing 30 to 40% of the food we need from doing more land. So we don't want to be in that place. We need, from a climate perspective, we need to be in a place where farmers use good varieties of seed that can respond to the climate they're working with. They have good ways of applying nutrients, not the old way, applying nutrients in terms of fertilizers to the soil in a way that is efficient and productive so that they can increase yields. But also you want to make sure that they have markets, access to markets. So there are all these things that are different than we are used to. So probably in a nutshell, what I would say, the world has changed on us from a smallholder perspective. I'm a daughter of a smallholder, so that's why I'm saying the world has changed on us. Knowledge is eroded. Varieties we know we are working are not going to work anymore. So it's really tough. It's tough. I would like to believe that we have what it takes, but that is going to be very difficult. I guess the good news is, because I sit on the Global Commission for Adaptation and Resilience, the good news is there's a lot of goodwill in investing in the right things and investing in finding solutions. Yeah.
So there's goodwill, there is a recognition of the problem, but it sounds like there's still a need for knowledge and expertise in order to deal with the extreme variabilities in the weather patterns in terms of coming up with the proper varieties in order to plant. And it sounds like there's still some work to be done there, but it's more of a recognition. So let's just move moving on to His Excellency, if he would like to comment next.
Thank you. Answering your question whether their knowledge and expertise exist, I would say in the definite, yes, it does. What stops us from deploying that? The actual economic model itself that we have created. And you need to kind of examine the model, because there is simply, in very realistic terms, incumbent structures who like business to continue as usual. There's nothing, why should I change? And now the question is, why are these business as usual incumbent industries all around the world are not worried about climate change? Well, because they don't see themselves part of this universal discourse, as long as their profitability is not impacted. So when they will only adapt and they will only deploy the knowledge and expertise when the purse is touched. And so then it becomes an issue whether we should make it costly for them to operate or not. And then the question goes to a philosophical question, the whole model of capitalism and how capitalism should it go unfettered, free market, free this, free that, or no, there are limitations because the impact of climate change is cross-jurisdictional. It does not impact a particular jurisdiction that might adopt a particular philosophy towards its economy. You might want to become an extreme capitalist in island X or country Y, but that adoption of that philosophy of economic philosophy could mean a negativity on my country, an impact on others. So I will take it back to the very rudimental fundamentals, the cultural aspect of our that govern, that from there we developed our economic modalities, our way of operating in the world. It's not about application of technology or the misapplication of technology. You know, oh, let's move technology from here, or let's put it there, maybe we've misapplied it. It's rather about our value system. And whether we can take that value system and, say that you cannot damage Mother Earth. It's not about also how much emissions that you can emit in the world. It's also about the alteration of the ecological system. Rivers, forests, mountains, and the combination of both will produce this calamity. So I'm no longer a believer of the application of technology as a solution at all, but rather I'm a believer of going down to the cultural DNA and trying to address this problem at a cultural level. And if we do that, that means that we don't, the knowledge and expertise exist. What we need is wisdom, I guess.
Wisdom, who could be against that? I wish us all some wisdom too. So technology and knowledge, expertise, that's not so much the issue. It's an issue of the economic model, of the willingness of governments and societies to work together to address the climate adaptation challenge. Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Martin, for your question. I like to just give you one example, which can really tell us the story. In the country Tanzania, and I've been working for the last 10 years. You know, for the maize production, in East African people eat maize as staple food. Everybody knows ugali, and looking for the maize production, and 1 acre maize, generally speaking, if you just look for the farm field, and they're only around the 10,000 plants, you know, as an agronomist by training myself. And it's far less sufficient to produce either for the food security and for the biomass. And we have been working for increasing the plant density from 10,000 plants acre into 24,000 acre. So for this, for instance, increase this density would mean two things: produce more grain, more maize grain for the food security, at the same time to produce, increase the biomass. And increase the biomass means we have to address, you know, when we talk about the climate issue, climate change issue, we have to talk about two dimensions. One dimension is that we have to look at the carbon emission. Because agriculture, forestry, and the land use, whole land use system contribute 25% of the total carbon emission. So we have to also look at not only adaptation, but also through the agriculture, we have to reduce the carbon emission, and increase maize production, because maize the carbon full plant, which has very high capacity for photosynthesis. In that process, you know, you increase the photosynthesis, means you increase the carbon fixation already in the biological production process. This is one area. But the problem, as previous speakers also mentioned, that it's not an issue of technology, whether technology is available, but at the same time, if you apply simply the soil preservation technology, like soil tillage, weeding, and preventing the soil moisture, it's very easy. So you have reduced the soil, you know, you have to really maintain the soil preservation technology. Those are the areas where we talk about climate change. But unfortunately, very few farmers actually are practicing. I personally been working for 10 years and increased from one farmer to use this technology, which we've been working with Gates Foundation together. And in 10 years, until maybe 1,500 farmers. So from 10 years, you can see. And it's not question of technology itself. Technology is available. And the climate change is not a new issue. And climate change has been the issue already. And this is the issue that we recognize today. It was the issue before. And farmers started, all research, we all started to address this issue. And we have started the adaptation process, everything. Therefore, technology is available. Not only not only technology available, but we have also developed the system. But the issue is that we don't have the capacity. We don't have the institutional capacity to really do it. And this lack of political commitment and also lack of institutional capacity is the issue. You cannot rely on the farmer individually. You need really organized. You need also public awareness. So at the same time, this is a comprehensive package. It's not only the climate adaptation issue. It's not only issue of Ministry of Agriculture. This is not the issue of Ministry of Agriculture. It's the issue of whole system, and therefore, I would really like to see that. And the adaptation, the climate change adaptation is not only issue of adaptation, it's the issue of change of whole system and change whole practice and whole policy system, not only for agriculture, but within the whole system of development policies for this. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
So knowledge and expertise, not the big issue in that case, but rather the need for uptake of what is already known and for institutional participation in the process to the degree that will accommodate that uptake in a holistic way. Mr. Cerrell.
Yes, thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's great to see adaptation on the agenda of such an esteemed forum and participants that I've been able to interact with over the last couple of days. I would say in a nutshell, for me, the idea is I think the goodwill is there. I think what's lacking is the political will. I think we have an understanding over the last several years now of the kinds of challenges and the impacts that, in particular, poor farmers are going to be facing, and I think with increasing intensity as climate change worsens. I think in part, since the Paris Agreement of 2016, there hasn't really been a unifying set of goals that people working on adaptation could get around. And so while we've known this is a looming threat, and mitigation certainly has dominated a lot of the debate about what we need to do on climate, on adaptation, we're playing more catch-up. I think in part the emergence or the reluctance to embrace adaptation as a unique challenge was really because perhaps people felt like to recognize that would be to admit failure on the mitigation side of things. But the truth is we're starting to see already some of the impacts of climate change in a very, very serious way. So I think the challenge is how do we scale up what we know works? The good news is that working on the MDGs, the SDGs more recently, we know how to reach vulnerable populations. We know how to address issues around resilience and people in vulnerable situations to the extent that they face more intense exogenous shocks. How do we carry forth some of those ways of working with those populations, as we know the challenges to agriculture and food systems will intensify with the threat of climate? So I think that is the good news. It shouldn't be surprising to you that at the Gates Foundation, we do think that there is a gap in financing and a consensus on the technological solutions that we know are going to be needed. I think R&D is going to be an important part. We've seen already that increased seed varieties that are more resilient to things like intense flooding or seasonal drought, which is worsening, has been already shown to be very effective in helping to help more farmers adapt to changing growing conditions. So I think that's an important element. I think there are other aspects that we're also starting to paint an important connection to, and one is access to inclusive finance. When a farmer has a drought, when a growing season continues to shorten, it shouldn't be to the catastrophic failures of that farmer. We know that there are other aspects, and access to inclusive finance is going to help more farmers withstand some of those shocks so that she can be better prepared in the future. So I think some of those elements bringing into this conversation as well is really important.
I'm going to continue with you, if you don't mind, Mr. Cerrell, because when we were preparing for this conference, I read quite a bit of the information that is related to climate change adaptation and also what your organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has been saying about it. Bill Gates says that in philanthropy, you look for problems that can't be fixed by governments or markets. I want to ask you about climate change adaptation. Is this a problem that markets and governments can fix?
Yes, I mean, we have to. We don't really have a choice, I would say. I think governments and markets do need to come together. I think the role of philanthropy, we obviously are very optimistic by. Philanthropy does provide both the patient capital and the risk capital that oftentimes governments or companies can't afford to bear the risk for. Philanthropies can have an important role in that regard. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing trying to fund more research and development to try to innovate on novel solutions on agriculture and really focus on solutions of the poorest where markets have simply failed, will, I think, help once you get to a certain point, allow companies to come in and scale up some of those solutions to the extent that they see more of a clear market return. And likewise, for governments, I think one of the things that we've tried to do, working with countries like Ethiopia, is to really help support, in the case of Ethiopia, a delivery unit that supported the government's ability to really transform its agriculture sector. I mean, Ethiopia remains one of the, I think, great success stories over the last 10 years or so. 2016-17, the drought was equivalent to the Ethiopia's very horrific and catastrophic drought of years ago, but we didn't hear as much about it. And that's because the country was able to put in place a much better system to help people withstand what was a really intense drought period. So in short, I'd say that philanthropy does have a role to play, and governments ultimately, with markets, do need to provide, I think, the scale of the kinds of solutions that we know will be needed.
By the way, I just want to emphasize that you guys are welcome to jump right in. If you hear a point that you want to follow up on or to take issue with, please do by all means just give me a signal and the floor is yours. But I'll direct a question to you, Dr. Kalibata, just a very simple question. I know that you work in many different African countries, not just in East Africa, but different parts of the continent. It's a large continent. The conditions are quite different. But if you were to summarize for us what it is that African farmers that you work with need most in order to address the challenge of climate change that they're coping with right now and what you see coming in the future.
So, so just to build on what Joy is saying, part of the reason we as AGRA actually work with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is that idea of fixing market failures from a public perspective, for example, where we as an institution are actually helping countries learn from each other, like the work they're doing in Ethiopia, learn from that, but also be able to move it across countries. So that is a very good example of how you use knowledge that is existing in some places, but use it to fix challenges across the continent by in a situation where nobody else would be interested in using their resources to do that, neither public nor private sector. So that's a typical case of what we are doing as AGRA. So in terms of what farmers, what was the question again? Sorry.
Well, it's what they need most. If you were to say, if you could do one thing, if you had the power to change something, to offer them something, to adapt, to cope with the adaptation challenge, what would it be?
So everybody here has said something that is important. But I guess what I would do the most of is fix the whole situation around political will and interest in fixing public challenges. Because, again, like I said, we work with smallholder farmers. They have very limited ability to handle situations that are outside their own means. So climate change is largely outside their means. To the extent possible, like was said here, a number of technologies are available. Even for those technologies that are falling through the cracks where they find that they are no longer doing what they wanted them to do, even for that knowledge that is falling through the cracks where they find that what they knew yesterday. And when I say this, it's extremely important that you understand. farmers in Africa knew when it would start raining. Like if it starts raining on 15th of August, it starts raining on the 15th of August. That knowledge is no longer there. This seed that works when it starts raining on 15th of August needs probably 90 days to mature. It's a different situation when that seed, all of a sudden, that 90 days is interrupted in the middle. So it becomes a different kind of seed. The need becomes different. So what they will need, what farmers will need, is the ability of governments to understand the change that has happened very quickly, to understand how to mobilize support, whether it is going to philanthropy, whether it's going to other partners, whether it is going to other institutions and other countries and mobilize the knowledge quickly and bring it forward. So the political will bit and working with institutions that can provide the capacity support that individual countries need, understand the capacity support that is needed, and provide that support is going to be probably the most important, because there are answers across the world. There are answers in different places for different problems, whether it's a variety here, whether it's financing and financial solutions, whether it is how to reach farmers. These solutions are in different places. The problem for individual countries and individual farming groups, they are not in their particular market. And to get them in that particular market where they are operating at, we'll need someone to do that for them. So that's why I'm saying the political will and the agility to be able to move quickly and bring these solutions to farmers is probably going to be the most important thing.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Qatar is a country that has a lot of gas, but very little water. It's basically a desert kingdom, and it faces very specific challenges when it comes to trying to provide food for itself. You've been responsible for food security in Qatar before. Qatar, since the blockade, has had a particularly big challenge in coping with the need for food security. Now, Qatar is also a wealthy nation. It can buy food and import food, but it has pushed Qatar to begin to think more seriously about food production and food security from a different point of view. I want to ask you if your country has learned anything through this process of coping with this situation, particularly with food security, that could be of value to other countries.
Thank you. Water and food are two types of commodity that could mean life and death. And the question is, how much faith can you put in the global trading system for your own survival? If the person, your neighbor on the other end, has the capability of either killing you or keeping you alive, then you're forever beholden to them. And that's the perspective that we've had since 2008 when the financial crisis happened, when food prices spiked worldwide, riots erupted everywhere. We found ourselves in a position that we could not mitigate the price fluctuation at our retail shops because we are net importers. So all that price fluctuation that happens outside our borders, Russia, India, many countries have put some restrictions on exporting food. So all traders did is pass the cost to the consumers. And all consumers had to think about is, where is the government? I mean, how could we from one evening to the other now have to pay 3 times, sometimes 8 times more the value of what I used to buy yesterday? So there needs to be a degree of predictability when at a consumer level of the value of food that you buy every day from your local grocer or supermarket that you go to. But that predictability is lost, and the consequence of that loss means lack of confidence in the government, in the security, in the government stating to people that this is a place to live, this is a place to do business, this is a place to prosper. So that's when the food security program was created. And the aim is to have a degree of control. I wouldn't go as far as saying sovereignty, total sovereignty, but I would say a degree of control that enables us to ensure that we can continue to live the life that we have today and capacity to grow. So that was the main, and so the blockade came to basically prove that point. We, at a certain point, relied on Saudi Arabia. 50% of our food came from them, medicine, and so on and so forth, equally from the UAE. And the good fortune is that we had planned, we had in the pipeline, in the preparations, we did not know that we had a blockade, but we certainly predicted certain scenarios that could happen in the region, like the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, airlines being down, and so on and so forth. There was a number of risk planning that went into producing the food security plan. And as a result, Qatar could immediately turn around. But there is a heavy bill. Let's not underestimate the cost of trying to maintain the status quo and not passing that cost to people. Simply because Qatar can afford it does not mean that this is the way it should be done.
Exactly, and my question was, have you learned something through this process that other countries might utilize in terms of coping with in adapting to climate change?
The biggest lesson, if you wish to continue the lifestyle that you have and want to grow, because we're a growing nation still, you want to make sure that you are in control of your fundamental resources. And that these fundamental resources are not in the hands of people who might have issues with because then they control your policy. Then you control their independence, you control the way you behave, you control the way you engage with others. And so that's exactly what our neighbors thought that they could do. By creating that blockade, that they will succumb us to agree to them politically. And luckily, we managed to evade that and forge our own independence away from them.
Thank you. Professor Li, you've played a key role in shaping rural development policy in China, as I mentioned earlier, and dealing with poverty reduction over years. Your work isn't done yet. China is still developing, is still responding to the changing environment, including a changing climate. I wanted to ask you, what role is climate change adaptation playing in your role, in your work, in trying to help China develop its rural sector, and particularly its agricultural sector?
Thank you very much for this. And I think my role has been primarily based on the two issues. One is to help our government to develop policy, and as well as the capacity to support small farmers. Because the small farmers, if you look for the small farmers, whatever's in the 1940s in US and the 1950s, 60s in Japan, and also China, Taiwan, and also in China now and African today, they are very similar. And if you look for the 1940s of the US, and the rapid adoption of improved maize varieties, and largely due to land-grant university-driven, system, partly with market force, this seed companies market force. So there are lessons very similar applied to Japan and also to China. And therefore, the one area where I've been working for is to look at that area. Secondly, to do a piloting exercise to link with the market force, which I like to address your first question to the panelists, that what is the role of the state and what is the role of the market in terms of improved adaptation of the climate change. And I will see the two areas and the two forces that are important when we talk about African issues. Again, the African issues, particularly in these two areas, very weak, not very strong. And therefore, you cannot say just whether the government is more important and the market is important. As both are important. We have to look for these issues. So the lessons, experiences from my own work over the last 30 years in China, and also linked with my work in other countries like Africa, and I realized that, well, the role of state is fundamentally important when the market force is very weak. You don't have a company, you don't have the market force there. You can see, you can nurture the company, enterprise, you can't do like this. Therefore, state is very important. When the market force come in, state role will have to be combined with the market, to really drive the services and all kind of factors to support small farmers. So that's something which I would see very relevant to the African situation today. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is winding down very quickly here. According to my clock, we only have about 7 minutes or so left until we're supposed to leave. And we are supposed to leave promptly, I'm told, because of the closing ceremony. So I would like at this time to invite questions from the audience. We'll try to collect a couple of questions first. And if you could please identify yourself and direct your question to a particular person. So we'll begin over kind of in the center with the gentleman who's standing there. And please raise your hand if you have another, who else? Okay, and then we'll go to you.
Hello, my name is Hassan and I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University in Qatar. So I have a quick comment and a question. The comment is, as we understand, philanthropic organizations essentially work on altruistic motives, not on market logic of price and profit. So they need to stop using market language because this practically creates confusion and absolves the notorious profiteering practices of private organizations, as one of the recent book in USA titled Winners Take All convincingly demonstrates. So my question is, we often hear about lack of political will from the part of national states, and the recent example is actually already happening today. So all day we have heard about
put the microphone to your mouth, please. Just a little bit.
COP25 because of some national governments' unwillingness. My question is, how is it possible for national states to not focusing on continued economic growth, which has been recognized as contributing to global warming, when these states have been put in a system defined by structural adjustment policies, structural adjustment loans promoted by IMF, World Bank, etc.
Thank you very much. The gentleman there who, yep.
My name is Christopher Cuevas, and I am a student at the University of Florida. We know that agricultural production is one of the major sectors that need to be addressed in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally. And most of the greenhouse gas emissions productions come from meat. In particular, beef and lamb alone are responsible for a majority of the emissions of the total agricultural sector. And that, combined with the public health issues that come with high meat consumption in the developed world, have led many academics to project in the future, a way that many national governments may want to address reducing emissions to meet mitigation goals is to alter their societies' consumption of meat through the use of tariffs and taxes. From an adaptation perspective,
do you have a question, sir? Because
yes.
We have very little time.
From an adaptation perspective, do you believe that that developed country governments can potentially address the issues posed by climate change by reducing countries' consumption of meat and changing dietary habits?
Thank you. Maybe one more for the gentleman or the lady here in the front. You two work it out which one is going to put the question. Okay. That would be great.
My name is Natalia Federighi. I work in corporate diplomacy. Before, I was the head of government affairs of Yara International. I would like to ask you if you think extension services is the good way to make agriculture attractive to the youth, as well as incorporating entrepreneurship tools for the farmers, because I see that some private companies invest a lot in extension services, but they don't have entrepreneurship tools that smallholder farmers really need to see agriculture as a business. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got quite a bit on the table already. There's something that I suspect was directed towards the Gates Foundation at the very beginning. Perhaps you can comment on that. Mr. Cerrell, we also have just heard a question about agricultural extension issues that you can decide who wants to talk about that. We've also had a question about meat production and its impact and what can be done there. So perhaps, Mr. Cerrell, you'd like to begin?
Sure, I welcome the question. I think that maybe the question, if I understand it correctly, was trying to understand the criticisms in Winners Take All, the critique of philanthropy, and some of the unintended consequences of otherwise, well-intentioned philanthropists. I think it's a good thing that some of these criticisms are lodged. It's always a good idea to hold your institution and I guess the philanthropic sector more accountable. I do think philanthropy has a strong role to play. I mean, part of what we're talking about, the organization that Agnes serves as head of the Alliance for a Green Revolution of Africa, was based on the work of the Rockefeller Foundation and the powerful interventions that they played in staving off of what would have been, by most estimates, of an awful catastrophe in India. So I think that it's good to challenge philanthropy. I think some of the criticisms are good and we take them to heart. I do think in the end, however, there's a good role to play in educating and providing good examples of what philanthropic investments can do and how that plays with governments and corporate investment.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kalibata, you might want to talk about agriculture and extension.
Yeah, thank you. So the question of agriculture extension is extremely important, and it is one of the recommendations coming of the Global Commission on Adaptation and Resilience, ensuring that advisory services reach the populations that are farming, mostly because how they farm, as many of the panelists have said, is extremely important. The methodology, the techniques, everything that comes with advisory services, but also the knowledge around what is available. So that is extremely important. Now, the point you're making around linking advisory services or extension to entrepreneurship is another extremely important issue, especially for youth. So one of the programs we run as AGRA to ensure that smallholders have access to advisory services that are sustainable, because at the end of the day, African countries have a challenge maintaining extension as a public good. So we are finding ways of linking extension to entrepreneurship so that it can be done in a profitable way for the people that do it. So we have what we call the village-based advisory services that is really an entrepreneurial thing that allows us to train and link extensions to businesses. They're actually paid by the businesses that they are working with. Of course, the governments do still maintain an ability to manage how that is delivered. So, fast forward, young people are farming.
If you could just
50%,
wrap it up pretty quickly, because
yeah.
we're over time.
I was just going to say, fast forward, I just want to end on that point. Young people are farming. Actually, 50% of the people that we work with are young, and they want to farm in a manner that is profitable. So, you're extremely right, linking them to entrepreneurial skills is something that we'll continue doing.
I'm sorry to have to wind this up so quickly, but yes, please.
One final word. For the developed world, they need to understand, as we're negotiating the climate agreement, the importance of adaptation. The alternative for them supporting adaptation in climate negotiation or in any future agreement is, the alternative is mass migration. People will not sit still and do nothing and wait for charity. They will just jump on boats, whatever means of transportation available to them, and they will find places where they don't need to have to adapt with the impacts of climate change.
Very good point. Dr. Lee, would you care to add anything to this, perhaps on the question of meat production, beef and lamb in particular?
Just one sentence. I think for the in the technological perspective, it is always possible to really take the challenge. At the same time, we have to really see, what you just asked, the question of whether it is possible to look at the mitigation of the climate change at the same time to still have this, increase in production. I think it's possible. Technology is available. As long as we have good institutions, we have political commitment, we have whole society aware that issue of climate change, and then we're going to move ahead, yeah.
Okay, still a lot of work to do. I want to thank, a warm round of applause, first of all, for all our speakers. And thank all of you for coming here to this session, and it was a great pleasure for me as well. Thank you.